Alrighty then, welcome to another video. And before I get into this video, do you guys like the picture that I put up in this video? Yeah, an audio recording with this picture that you are looking at right now. Yeah, that's a picture of two stuffed animals sitting in two stuffed animals in chairs at a round table, and there's a Bluetooth keyboard next to the stuffed panda bear, and there's a notebook laptop computer next to the stuffed white bear. And also on the table, along with the Bluetooth keyboard and the laptop notebook computer, is two bottles of Perrier. Let me run this down. Okay, there's two stuffed animals. One is a panda bear, and the other is a white bear. And they're both seated in chairs at a round table. And there is a Bluetooth keyboard and a notebook laptop computer. Also, the Bluetooth keyboard is near the stuffed panda, and the laptop notebook computer is near the stuffed white bear. And on the table, along with the notebook computer and the Bluetooth keyboard, is two bottles of Perrier. Yeah, I put all of this together to take that picture. So so I'm gonna use this picture as the discussion roundtable, because this video is a discussion roundtable video. Okay, let me see what time it is. Okay, the time is 10:25 p.m. local time, and today's date is June the 1st, 2026. Okay, I got that out of the way. In this roundtable discussion video, I'm going to be talking about why the state of Texas is continued to execute people with intellectual disabilities on death row. And to help me out, I have a crappy HP Slade 7 video version of myself reading about this on my smartphone. So here I am. In this video, this video is a question. And the question is, why Texas won't stop executing people with intellectual disabilities? And I want to go ahead and read this. Texas continues to execute individuals with intellectual disabilities, largely due to the state's courts' reliance on non-clinical subjective tests rather than modern medical standards. The U.S. Supreme Court banned the execution of people with intellectual disabilities in the 2002 Atkins versus Virginia ruling, but allowed states to create their own methods for defining the condition. Texas's system is primarily stalled by the following factors: the Barrazo factors. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, CCA, invented its own set of legal criteria to define intellectual disability, consequently known as the Barrazo factors. These criteria were notorious based on part on the fictional character Lenny from from John Steinbeck's novel of Mice and Men. Lay stereotypes versus clinical science. The Texas tests rely on layman stereotypes, such as whether a defendant could lie, drive a car, or plan parts of their defense. Medical professions, by contrast, rely on standardized IQ testing and clinical elevations of daily living skills. Scouts remnants. The U.S. Supreme Court has repeatedly struck down Texas's tests for being unscientific and unconstitutional. For example, in the Layman Moore versus Texas cases 2017 to 2019, the Supreme Court ruled that Texas must stop substituting clinical standards with its own interventions. Lack of legislative action. Despite these Supreme Court rulings, the Texas legislature has consequently failed to codify clinical medical standards into the state law. This absence of a clear standardized state law leaves the criteria subject to interpretation by local judges and prosecutors. Okay, here's a list of people with intellectual disabilities who have been executed on death row in Texas. I'm going to read the full I'm gonna read something that will represent the list of people with intellectual disabilities who were put to death in Texas. Okay. While the U.S. Supreme Court banned executing intellectually disabled individuals in 2002, Atkins versus Virginia, Texas courts have maintained heavily debated criteria. This has led to the continued execution of individuals with sub-average IQ scores and adaptive functioning defects. Notable individuals executed in Texas with documented evidence of intellectual disabilities include Edward Busby Jr., executed on May the 14th, 2026, despite experts universally agreeing that he had intellectual disabilities. His execution proceeded after the U.S. Supreme Court filled a temporary stay. His death marked the 600th execution in Texas. Marvin Lee Wilson, executed August the 7th, 2012, executed despite an IQ score of 61. State courts rejected his claim, learning on other tests that yield higher scores. Ed Rowley Chester, executed June the 12th, 2013, executed with an IQ measured at 68, preserving severe adaptation defects such as an inability to name all 12 months of the year. Robert Lade, executed January the 29th, 2015, executed despite IQ test scores consistently placing him in the intellectual disabled range. Gary Green, executed March the 7th, 2023, executed despite his attorneys preserving evidence of severe intellectual disability and a history of mental illness. Okay, I'm going to read all of this. When I get done, I'm going to give my thoughts on this. Well, get my thoughts on all of this. Excuse me. Yeah, when I get done reading all of this, I'm going to get my thoughts on all of this. Okay, I'm going to read something about Marvin Lee Wilson. Marvin Lee Wilson, January the 5th, 1958 to August the 7th, 2012. was executed by the state of Texas on August the 7th, 2012, despite a 2004 test finding his IQ was 61. Supreme Court rulings subsequent to his execution in 2014, Hall versus Florida, in 2017, Moore versus Texas, ruled that the 8th Amendment protected people with this low of an IQ from being executed under the discretion some states, including Texas, were using at the time. Wilson has previously scored 75, 75, and 79, all above the threshold to be considered intellectually disabled, on 3 other tests administered by state authorities. Wilson had also scored 73 at a test given where he was 13. The 2004 test, which found Wilson to be intellectually disabled, was further discredited when prosecutors found that it had been administered by a PhD candidate rather than a confusing clinical psychologist. Texas successfully used crime allegations specifies to argue against the expert IQ, but the states are no longer allowed to do that. He entered death row on May the 9th, 1994 for the murder of a police drug informant who had caught him dealing cocaine. On November the 10th, 1992, Wilson abducted and shot 21-year-old Jerry Robert Williams following a physical confrontation between the two in the 1500 block of Vero in Beaumont. Wilson then left the body of Williams at a bus stop where it was later found by a bus driver. At the time of the murder, Wilson had 2 previous convictions for robbery, one of them aggravated. Wilson's IQ has been claimed to be measured at 61, which meant that he was legally intellectually disabled and thus eligible for execution, according to Atkins versus Virginia, a United States Supreme Court ruling against execution of retarded individuals. However, the United States Courts of Appeal for the Fifth Circuit originally ruled in December 2005 that due to his lawyer missing a filing deadline, Wilson was unable to file further appeals in federal court. On March the 10th, 2006, the Fifth Circuit Court granted Wilson permission to file an appeal. In this option, the court wrote, "We are satisfied that these are the sort of rare and extraordinary circumstances that justify waiving the filing deadline." The National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty states that Wilson's case illustrated one of the many ways the AEDPA, Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, was severely limited the ability of death row inmates to have their convictions and sentences reviewed to determine if they are being held contrary to the laws of the Constitution. He was imprisoned as Texas Department of Criminal Justice TDCJ inmate number 009999098. Wilson was initially located to the Ellis unit, but was transferred to the Allen B. Pomorsky unit, formerly the Terrell unit, near Livingston, Texas, in 1999. He was executed in Huntsville unit, Huntsville, Texas. Okay, more. All right, I'm going to read this. Texas courts rely on mice and men to define intellectual disability and sentence people to death. Bobby James Moore has a lifelong intellectual disability, yet he sits on Texas's death row because the courts there used John Steinbeck's of Mice and Men to decide his fate. That's right. The Texas Criminal Court of Appeals went with a fictional novel over science and medicine to measure Bobby's severe mental limitations. The justices heard a vast body of evidence demonstrating these limitations, which met the widely accepted scientific standards for defining intellectual disability. Then they rejected it all according to 7 wildly unscientific factors for measuring intellectual disability, drawn in large part from the fictional character Lenny Small. Bobby was no Lenny. They concluded, ruling that this disability wasn't extreme enough to exempt him from the death penalty. On Friday, the Supreme Court will decide wherever to take Bobby's case. Executing people with intellectual disabilities is unconstitutional. The gray area is that the Supreme Court allows the states to define intellectual disability, leaving an opening for Texas to create a standard based partly on of mice and men. With its decision in Hall versus Florida 2 years ago, though, the Supreme Court made clear that states may not adopt definitions of intellectual disability that don't conform to accept scientific standards. It's hard to come up with a less scientific standard than a novel written nearly 80 years ago. No one's life should depend on an interpretation of Steinbeck. Under current professional standards, a person with an intellectual disability has significant defects in intellectual functioning, IQ, and significant defects in adaptive functioning. How well one adjusts to daily life that manifests before the age of 18. Bobby has a clear intellectual disability that has been evident his entire life. Living in Houston in the 1970s, Bobby's family was so poor that they often went without food. Bobby and his siblings found discarded food in the neighborhood's trash cans. When they got sick from the scraps, Bobby's siblings stopped eating from the trash cans, but Bobby never learned that lesson. He would eat the discarded food and get sick over and over again. Growing up, Bobby rarely spoke. His teachers suspected that he had an intellectual disability, but they did not know what to do with him. They would ask Bobby to sit and draw pictures while they taught the rest of the class reading, writing, and math, or worse, they would send him to the hallway to sit alone. Bobby failed the first grade twice, but was socially promoted to second grade. His abusive and alcoholic father slammed the door in the face of the few teachers who tried to intervene on Bobby's behalf. When he reached age 13, Bobby still didn't know the days of the week, the months of the year, the seasons, or how to tell time. The school system finally acknowledged that Bobby should receive some intervention, and counselors recommended that his teachers drill him daily on this basic information. But by that point, it was too late. The schools continued to socially promote him until he dropped out of school in the 9th grade. Without support of his disability, in an effort to escape his violent home life, Bobby was left to survive on the streets. He got caught up with the wrong crowd, and at 20 years old, he followed two acquaintances who had made plans to rob a store. Bobby was armed with a shotgun, though the group just wanted money and had no intention to kill anyone. But Bobby panicked when an employee screamed and he accidentally discharged the shotgun. He did not learn until later that his gunshot blast had hit the clerk. Bobby was charged with homicide in 1980 and sent to death later that same year. He and his lawyers didn't have a chance to present evidence of his intellectual disability until more than 20 years later, when the Supreme Court ruled in Atkins versus Virginia that the Constitution forbids the execution of people with intellectual disability. Bobby's attorneys then petitioned for a hearing to show that he could be exempt from the death penalty. He presented evidence from multiple experts and decades of records showing Bobby's intellectual disability. Over the years, his IQ scores have ranged from the low 50s to the 70s, with an average score of 60.66. Using the appropriate scientific standards, the judge found that Bobby met the current definition of intellectual disability and should be sentenced instead to life without parole. But the state appealed. That's when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals used its unscientific factors, roughly based on Lenny, to uphold Bobby's death sentence. The court ignored the Supreme Court's ruling and held that determining intellectual disability should never be subject to a strict 7-point cutoff. In fact, when the state's own expert tested Bobby, he scored 57. Lenny Smalls was never meant to appear in court. He is a figment of John Steinbeck's imagination. Texas must stop using such unscientific factors as an excuse to execute people with intellectual disabilities who don't fit Lenny's mold. The Supreme Court must give Bobby a second chance to live. And that's going to be a failure because the state of Texas is going to kill him anyway. So I think this story is old. I think he already been put to death. I don't know. Okay, I'll talk about it in an audio recording. I'll talk about all of this in an audio recording. Okay, the state of Texas, the state that I'm living in right now, has executed 600 people on death row. 600 people on death row. That is absolutely insane. It's just complete and utter madness. And I find the death penalty, I find Texas and other states that practice the death penalty by killing people on death row, regardless if they have a disability, non-disabled, innocent, guilty, or from a foreign country. It doesn't matter. Like people, it doesn't matter. Like the United States just is still practicing this backwards, medieval, inhumane, cruel violation of human rights. They continue to practice this while other countries like France, Canada, the UK, and others abolished the death penalty. And yeah, what I think about the death penalty, what I think about states in the United States, also the state that I'm living in, Texas, what I think about these states killing people on death row. I'm gonna give a full description on this. Um, yeah, I find the death penalty to be inhumane, cruel, barbaric, and a violation of human rights. And also, it's a waste of taxpayer money. So I live here in Texas, a state that loves to kill people on death row. Yeah, I find it to be a waste of my tax dollars. My tax dollars are going to something that doesn't benefit me. And you got some people who support the death penalty in Texas, and they'll say this: if you kill someone on death, if you kill somebody, if you kill a police officer and kill innocent people, you will face the ultimate justice in Texas, and that you will be executed. And the ultimate justice, well, I don't find states who do state-sanctioned killings and killing people on death row to be an ultimate justice. Basically, you're just killing someone and taking their life. And the state of Texas has a lot of blood on its hands. And the state of Texas doesn't care. The state of Texas is just doing this to be tough and telling everybody, don't mess with Texas. So yeah, I find the state of Texas to use a fictional character from a storybook to determine if someone with an intellectual disability should be put to death or not. Like saying stuff is, oh, this guy's a Lenny, this guy's is not a Lenny, this guy's a Lenny. It's completely insane and it's ridiculous that a sitting Texas court is turning to a fictional character to determine if an intellectual disabled individual should be put to death or not. And it's called the Brazo factor, which is not based in science. And I think the state of Texas should be using science than a fictional character from the imagination of a man who wrote a book. And get this, former Texas Governor Rick Perry, when he was governor of Texas, when someone talked to him about the death penalty, Rick Perry just fell to the ground and started laughing like it's funny. Well, it's not funny. Like, okay, if you find killing people on death row to be funny, then you're sick in the head. You got problems. There's something wrong with you. You need to go see a therapist. And that's funny. Here on YouTube, I have some people coming onto this channel and watching some of the videos that I posted on this channel telling me that I need to go see a therapist. Well, if a grown man falls to the ground and start laughing at someone who brings up the death penalty in Texas, and his eyes light up in happiness, then a person like that needs to go see a therapist in a bunch of mental health professions, and they need to go take a bunch of pills that will help them, quote unquote, cope with their problems. And if they take these pills are going to make them drowsy, non-responsive, make them sleep all the time, sleepy, and gain weight. Reading that article about Bobby Moore, when he went to school, he barely spoke, and he couldn't learn anything, and the teachers that he had at that school didn't know what to do with him, so they made him sit outside the classroom while the teachers teach the children, his peers, how to read and write and do math. And it just shows that people who do stuff like that don't understand people with disabilities. Like a person like Bobby Moore could be taught something. I mean, if he had special accommodations and placed in a special learning environment or a special sitting where he can learn with the rest of the children, maybe he will turn out better. Maybe he'll be fully educated. And plus, he was dirt poor. He was so poor that his brothers and sisters and himself ran around eating garbage out of trash cans in the neighborhood that they lived in some city in Texas, and they all got sick. And Bobby didn't learn his lesson. He kept eating garbage food from garbage cans that made him sick. And I guess here in Texas, a black man who was brought up poor doesn't mean anything. If he kills someone, he should be put to death. And that is no excuse. That's just a failing from the state of Texas. Texas just flat out don't care. And it's funny. And you got people here on YouTube like Doc Garcia talking about he's going to leave a legacy on both of his YouTube channels, and say he's going to leave a legacy and he's going to be a mentor to a young child. And people like Doc Garcia and people in other parts of the U.S. see people like Bobby Moore, people with disabilities, they just flat out don't care. They don't care. They don't care, and they talk about building something up for the next generation. Well, how about children with disabilities? How about helping them? How about building something up for them and helping them out so they won't fall through the cracks like people like Bobby Moore? How about that? But those type of people here in the U.S., they just flat out care. They just flat out don't care. They see someone like Bobby Moore who killed somebody, they believe that person should be punished, and they don't care about that person having an intellectual disability, a learning disability, Down syndrome, have mild mental retardation, severely schizophrenic. And there's this guy who I went to school with. He's spending 60 years in prison for attempted murder on trying to kill a drug dealer who cheated him out of his money. And the drug dealer went and lied on him to the police, saying that he tried to kill him, but the drug dealer never told the authorities who he was and what he was into. And so, and the guy who I went to school with had a crappy public defender defending him in court. And after the murder trial, he was found guilty and he was sentenced to 60 years for attempted murder. So he's spending 60 years in prison. And one of the women who were girls at a school that I went to, it was a girl who I went to school with. She's married and she has a daughter. I'm not going to say her name. I told her about him and she said this: "Oh yeah, I remember him." Laugh out loud. "He never liked white people. I never liked him. It's like he hated white people." Well, he hated white people because he was mentally ill and he was on his mentally ill episodes. But people like her don't give a shit. You know, and it's just sad that a country like the United States, its citizens don't give a shit about people with disabilities who are mistreated and treated like dirt here in the U.S. And this is not in the United States. This is in other countries as well. You got disabled people in the United Kingdom who are treated like dirt, teased and picked on. And I look at this. This is unacceptable. You know, it's funny. Here in the modern age, they talk about giving rights and treating people who are LGBTQ, gay, black, and who are people from other countries living in a foreign country, and people in countries like Ukraine who are being slaughtered, who are being killed in a war. Yeah, Ukraine. Yeah, people in Ukraine, the children in Ukraine and families are being killed by Russia. Society, well, people, countries around the world care so much. I don't know, some countries, they care so much about these people, but they don't care about people with intellectual disabilities or people who are disabled / special needs. It's just a failing on society, on the human race. And how can a human being can treat another human being so badly? It's like this, okay, like a little, it's like this, okay, a lion cub gets treated badly by the other lion cubs. They bite on his tail, they bite his tail off, they bite on him, and they rough him, and they treat him so badly. Then when the lion grows up, he's skin and bones, his tail's been bitten off, then he falls to the ground and dies. That's how people with disabilities are treated here in the U.S., let alone here in the state of Texas. And before I end this video, I'm going to read this in video form. Okay, before I end this video, I'm going to be reading this. Okay. What will happen if the state of Texas started smearing cow dung all over the dead bodies of death row inmates with disabilities, people from other U.S. states, and people from other countries after being executed on death row? And after that, tell everybody, don't mess with Texas. What will countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, and other countries around the world will view this? Okay, answer. If the state of Texas engaged in post-mortem desecration of executed individuals with disabilities from other jurisdictions by smearing them with cow dung and declaring "Don't mess with Texas," it would provoke immediate universal outrage. This hypothetical scenario would trigger severe legal, diplomatic, and economic fallout. Diplomatic and international relations, severe condemnation. Countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand, often referred to as the core Five Eyes allies alongside the U.S., would view this as a barbaric and grotesque violation of human dignity. International backlash. The act would likely be condemned globally as a human rights violation, sparking UN investigations and formal resolutions. Travel and trade impacts. Allies might issue travel warnings for Texas, and human rights organizations would likely push for international sanctions, diplomatic boycotts, or trade disruptions against the state. Legal and human rights implications. Treaty violations. Such an act would violate several international treaties the U.S. is party to, including the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations, as foreign nationals from the United Kingdom, Canada, or Australia will be involved. Human rights laws. It would also blatantly breach the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or disregarding treatment or punishment. Domestic and international lawsuits. The families of the deceased in their prospective countries will launch immediate high-profile lawsuits in U.S. federal courts and international tribunals, citing cruel, unusual, and disregarding treatment of the dead. National and state fallout. Severe constitutional challenges. Within the United States, this would spark massive constitutional debates. Such acts would be challenged in the U.S. Supreme Court as a violation of the 8th Amendment, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, and the 14th Amendment, due process and equal protection, particularly concerning inmates with disabilities. Massive boycotts. The stunt would result in immediate domestic outrage, leading to widespread economic boycotts of Texas businesses, tourism, and conventions by individuals and corporations across the country. Yeah, that would be true. Yeah, if Texas started to smear cow feces all over the dead bodies of death row inmates after killing them on death row, it will be an outrage. I think in other U.S. states, and also in countries like the United Kingdom, UK, France, Australia, New Zealand, most of Europe, Latin America, the country north of the U.S., Canada. Yeah, I said Canada. Yeah. Everybody who lives outside everybody who lives outside of Texas, everybody who lives outside of Texas will be outraged if they see that Texas is smearing cow dung all over the dead bodies of death row inmates, regardless if they're disabled or not, or if they're native Texans or non-Texans, or if they're disabled or non-disabled, or they're guilty of murder and not guilty of murder. Yeah, like this will be a public outcry. Yeah, I'll be shocked at this. And and as crazy as lawmakers, conservative lawmakers here in Texas are, they'll probably do something like this, and they will, because people like Texas Governor Greg Abbott, the Lieutenant Governor, conservative politicians in the Texas State House. Yeah, like these people are just as off the wall and crazy and just completely Looney Tunes. They're just as madmanish to do something like this. Because they're all white, Caucasian, and I live in a state, Texas. I live in a state that has the highest uninsured rate of people with no health insurance, a strict abortion ban, to force a woman to carry a baby that she doesn't want, or she already has some children and she doesn't want another child. She's forced to to carry this baby full term and give birth to this baby. Yeah, all under pro-life. And these people, these conservative politicians here in Texas, don't care about life. They don't. I mean, they care about that life that's inside that woman's womb, her body. But when that woman goes into labor and pushes that baby out of her body, and once that baby, that unborn life, leaves that woman's body, then they don't care about that life anymore. And heaven forbid, if that life grows up poor and eating garbage out of trash cans and have an intellectual disability and never learned anything at a school that he went to, with the teacher sending him outside the classroom and sit outside the classroom while the teacher teaches the other students how to read and write and do math. And if this life grows up and gets involved in a murder, that unborn life will be put to death here in Texas and executed, be killed on death row. And before that, like when the life leaves that body, these conservative politicians who are pro-life, they will run around and cut programs for that unborn life, which is life now, to survive on. It's just absolutely disgusting, and it just makes me sick to my stomach. Like, I just shake my head in shame. And to these people these people here in the U.S. who live in other states in the U.S. who are a bunch of insecure 40-year-olds or a bunch of Americans who don't care about stuff like this, who don't give a shit about stuff like this, and they talk about leaving a legacy of videos on their two YouTube channels and care about being a mentor to people of the next generation. I'm going to say this to these people. Fuck you. You guys don't give a shit. You guys are just heartless pieces of crap that makes me sick to my stomach. Yeah. And all these mass shootings that happen here in the U.S., like in America, is killing off their next generation. And what kind of legacy that they're going to leave? They're going to leave a legacy to dead bodies, a corpse. And I feel sorry for those poor children who died in that mass shooting in Uvalde. So, you know what, life in America is just going to go on as usual. Nothing's not going to change. Celebrities, regular everyday people, politicians don't care about the stuff that I'm talking about in this video. So, they're just a bunch of heartless human beings who don't give two fucks. All right. So that's all I gotta say in this video. More videos to come. Cheers and au revoir. Merci beaucoup. Merci. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir. And in all of this, I'm just going to say this. Everything I said in this video, everything that I said in this video, I'm going to say this. C'est la vie, c'est la vie, c'est la vie, c'est la vie. That's life.